All right. Assalamu alaikum everyone and good afternoon. Welcome to day one of live webinar week. And the first session today is using textbooks effectively. And our facilitator for the session is Neda Mulji. Neda? Over to you, Neda.
I'm here. I'm here.
Yes, all right. Should we begin or?
Yes, we're ready to start. Assalamu alaikum everyone and a very warm welcome to the first session in our live webinar week. Thank you all for joining us, whichever time zone you're here from. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you all. I hope you enjoy this entire week of webinars. We're starting with my own webinar, which is using textbooks effectively. I work as a senior manager at Oxford University Press, Pakistan. I have been in adult education and in higher education for quite a few years now. So I'm looking forward to lots and lots of engagement from you in the chat box. Please feel free to write your comments and your questions as we go along. And I would be happy to stop and address them throughout the webinar. So let's begin. Thank you, Seema, for that. If you can flip to the next slide. Thank you. So my first question to you all is, if you were to write a textbook, which subject would you write on and why? So would you write a textbook for English, for mathematics, for science, for Islamia, Urdu, geography, history? Which textbook would you like to write? Now, I know as teachers, sometimes we feel, if I had written this textbook, I would have done this differently. So I'd like to know, which subject would you like to write on and why? I'm going to wait for 30 seconds for your answers to come into the chat box. I hope you can all hear me clearly. If you can't, please do let us know in the chat box so I can raise my volume a little bit. Tuba, will you let me know when some answers come into the chat box?
Yes. Nida, I've just received a single answer from Afsha here. She's written science.
And
so we're going to wait for, yes.
Okay. Yeah. Would you like to give us a reason?
We've got a few more answers here, and most of them seem to be science. And the reason why she's chosen science, Mariam, is because I know about the subject. That's the reason. Somebody's written a grammar tree. I don't know. I can't see the name here. Hira's written maths. Roma's written science. Sayyida Sabah has written English. And science and chemistry from someone who's anonymous. And Amara's written maths, mathematics, English, all of these. And I have a lot of responses for English and maths. It seems to be popular. Another one for Urdu, English and science. That's what it is.
Thank you very much. So Seema, can we have the next slide, please? The reason why I asked you to tell me about the textbook that you would like to write is because research shows that teachers feel very, very comfortable, and so do their students when they come from a place of knowledge. So someone said, because they know about it, usually you would want to write a textbook for a subject that you know very, very well. The idea of using a textbook effectively is to understand your textbook so well that you know every bit of it. So in our session, if you can see the outcomes on the screen, we will now talk about the usefulness of textbooks. So what can we get out of them in the little time that we have with our students every day? And how do we address the content, the knowledge, and the skills? So just to have a little bit of awareness of the skills that we are aiming to develop in our students can make all the difference in how we take the content to them. Again, because we have to cover large amounts of content in very little time that we have every day with the students, we end up encountering many challenges along the way. There are some students who will have a different level and pace of learning than the others in the classroom. And so as teachers, we've got to juggle that as well. How do we use a student-led approach to counter these difficulties? That's something I'd like to talk about as we go through the webinar. Next one, please, Seema. Thank you. What is the best thing about books, according to you? So you read books, you teach from textbooks. What do you think is the best thing about books? Can you write down your answer in the chat box, please? So George W. Bush said one of the great things about books is sometimes there are some fantastic pictures. It seems that layout really matters to students. The kind of pictures that they see in the textbook and the way the text is laid out and not cluttered together as heavy material makes a big difference to how students receive the learning. What do you think the children are most interested in when they work through the textbook? What do they look for? Next slide, please. And Tuba, do let me know if you have answers in the chat box. Okay. So what is it essentially that we do as teachers when we hold a textbook in our hand? The idea is when we talk about student engagement, and most of us as teachers aim to keep our students engaged, interested, and with us in aiming towards the student learning outcomes. Ultimately, it's the student learning outcomes that we're chasing because we want to prepare our students for the assessments that they will be taking. And we have an eye on their academic performance at all times. How do you ensure that a textbook comes to life for your students? An activity here, an activity there might involve students in hands-on learning, but it doesn't always engage them in ways that sustain interest in the subject and the textbook. So how do you do that as a teacher? How do you help your students engage with a textbook in a way that makes the book come to life for them? Let me know if
a
you
few
get any
answers for your previous questions. They've said knowledge with visuals when you ask them, what is the best thing about books? Authenticity, reliability. Also, they're up to grade level and you sum up the content there, words and their meanings, diagrams, pictures. So most of them are talking about activities and pictures or visuals related to those topics and sentences that are presented in the book. There are activities related to every topic and textbook. They're talking about knowledge, imagination, pictures, vocabulary, text, and all of that. And they're engaging and they trigger interest in the student. Then there's pictorial approach. So that's what they've talked about. And because it is easy to teach through textbooks, that's something that they've written here. And in response to this question, I'll just take in the responses and then I'll let you know.
Sure. And next, please, Seema. Right, so you've talked about activities, you've talked about visuals, diagrams, and how to lay out the information, and all of that works really well. However, time and again, we have these very lengthy chapters that must be condensed in a very short period of time. If you could tell the students a story by summarizing the chapter. So let me give you an example. The first one is from Know Your World. When we talk about, and that's a social studies book, and this particular one is from book 6. Some of you may be familiar with this social studies book of ours. You might want to, if you're talking, and I'm just giving you an example, if you're talking about dynasties or empires, and you want to introduce it, you want to talk about how that empire was formed, and what helped that empire grow, what did it do in its peak and how did it fall? What were the factors that contributed to the fall of an empire? You might want to package it as a story for the students. So you could actually start with, let me tell you a story about the Mughal Empire, or let me tell you a story about the Persian Empire. There was a man who led this empire valiantly, courageously, and then you begin with a dramatic version of the story to engage them in the content, inevitably your students will want to go back home to that textbook to learn more about that particular text that you spoke about in the classroom, because human beings at all levels and all ages love stories. It evokes a certain amount of emotion in them, which is really where you get the hook to get the students interested in the content that you're teaching. If you look at the World Watch book that we have, this is geography and it talks about Sialkot. One other way of doing that is to talk about Sialkot as a story. When I was a little child, I went to Sialkot and this is what I saw, and talk about the historical sites, the features of the place, talk about the dates and when that town was established. And we can very creatively as teachers make it all up. Even if you've never been to Sialkot, it's okay to take the content from the book and wrap it up in a story. Next slide, please. The next step after you've told the story and you've engaged the students is to show them a variety of ways of studying that content. Showing and not just telling is really, really important for students, because for those of you who have taken a flight somewhere, you would know when we're sitting on the plane, we have a leaflet there telling us what to do in case of an emergency landing. We know exactly what instructions to follow because it's given to us step by step. However, many of us are guilty of not pulling out that leaflet and reading it. Secondly, those that read it will retain only 20% of it. But they top that up by giving us a demonstration. The crew always give us a demonstration of what to do in case of an emergency landing. And the reason is when something is demonstrated to us, it makes it really easy. So the next step in bringing a textbook to life is to simplify it for the students, to show them how to use it. So that's something we will talk about next. Next slide, please, Seema. The outlining note-taking method is a very useful method of engaging students in processing the content that they have read. So once you've told them the story, you might want to go back to the text, read it aloud with them, or read it aloud for them, depending on their age, and then ask them to jot down, first write down the main topic. And then within the main topic, divide it into 3 key areas or 3 subtopics. Within each subtopic, all they need to do is circle the key information in the text and put it down in their notes. If they listen to what the teacher says and write down everything that the teacher has said, they won't be processing the information. But if they make the notes themselves using their key findings, and if you can show them how by using the method on the screen, it simplifies the content for them. It breaks it up into smaller chunks that are easier for students to handle. Next, please. Thank you. So how can we make the content easier? Most of the challenges that we face in the classroom is about the content either being too boring because the students are not interested, or the content being too difficult. The idea is to break it down, because I'm going to ask you 4 very quick questions. If you can write your answers in the chat box, that'll be great. Or you can reflect and think of those answers and then just hang on to them. Can you eat a whole cake in one bite? I probably not. Even if you have the biggest mouth on the planet, you can probably not gulp down an entire cake in one bite. The idea is that children cannot digest, cannot process, can't retain information from one long chapter all at one go. It has to be broken down into easier parts that can be handled by them. Can you eat the same cake every day? Probably not. So when we advise students to study, it helps to let them decide which topic they'd like to study and for how long. Because when parents make the schedule for the children, and let's say there's a geography test coming up and they ask them to study the same chapter for 4 consecutive days, it will get really, really boring. It's the same as having the same meal every day. So when students draw up a studying schedule, teachers might want to show them how to access a different variety, how to give themselves a variety to study every day. So just half an hour of maths and half an hour of geography and half an hour of science might work better than 3 consecutive hours of science. And my next question to you is, would you eat something if you were being forced by someone? Again, probably not. So if you don't want to eat something that you're being forced to eat, then I would like you to think about whether parents and teachers should be forcing children to study. The idea is to let them decide. So give them teach them ways of studying, and then let them draw up their own schedules. Would you recommend a cake to others if you don't enjoy eating it? Probably not, because if you don't enjoy eating a cake, you wouldn't want to give it to others either. So what you would want to do is you would want to test the children by letting them teach a topic that you're teaching them. When they have the textbook open in front of them, if they can turn to their partner and teach what they've just learned, and then flip sides, and the second person in the pair takes a turn to teach, that will help you monitor exactly who has processed the information and who hasn't, because they will have no clue and they won't be able to teach it if they haven't processed the information. Next, please, Seema. So bite-sized learning, how does it help? I'm going to ask you to think about yourself in the classroom, think about the textbook that you teach. How long does it take your students to complete the homework that you set? So generally, when you set homework, do you expect them to spend 15 minutes on it? Do you expect them to spend half an hour or 45 minutes on it? Could you write your answers in the chat box? Or if you could open the link that Tuba will paste in the chat box, please, Tuba, if you could paste the ideas board link, it'd be really nice for us to have your answers with us. So you just need to click on the link and it will show you 4 different questions there. And you need to click on the sticky note, which is a plus sign, and write your answers there. Or you can write in the chat box, whatever is easier for you. How long does it take you to finish 1 chapter with the class? Does it take you 2 lessons? Does it take you 1 week, 2 weeks? How often do your students get a chance to teach others in class? Are you the only one teaching? Or do you break them up into groups and let them teach each other? Or in pairs and let them teach each other? Or choose one person who can get up and teach the class from the front, which is also called student-led learning. And how can you increase your students' talk time in class? So if you've got a 45-minute period, do you as a teacher do the talking for 30 minutes out of that 45 minutes? Or can you flip it and minimize your talk time to about 15 minutes and let the students talk the rest of the time? And why is it important for students to talk during the class about the chapter, about the learning? We're going to talk about that as we go through the webinar towards the end, really. So I'm going to wait for about 2 minutes, if that's okay, for you to jot down your answers to those 4 questions.
In the meanwhile, I'll share a few responses that the participants have shared in the chat box. They've talked about what you were talking about, the flipping the, using a flipped classroom strategy. They've also talked about, starting with activities to pique their interest. Also, I think you asked about the time. So they're saying I said 45 minutes at least for them to finish their homework. Also, they've talked about, it shouldn't be monotonous. So you need to actually engage the students by thinking about what they are interested in. And also pictures, using pictures. And there's I don't know the name, it's anonymous. The teacher should know about the 5 E's model of teaching, and they should use it in the classroom. That's what they're saying. So yes, using and applying the activities and relating them to real life is what they've been doing. And these are a few responses. Also, they've talked about role playing, making them act out the scenes in the classroom. Also, depending on the length and the concepts in the chapter, that's something that they've talked about. Through activities, and yes. And one of them, Mariam, has shared that it takes 2 or 3 weeks depending on the activities and the contents that are there in the chapter. So that's what they do. 3 lessons is what maths is written. And in English, Maria Nida Peter uses pair and group learning. So I would agree with that. I used to go for it myself when I was teaching. 45 minutes, 2 to 3 days is what they've written. And I've shared the link of the ideas board in the chat box. If they're replying there, would you like me to share the screen? No, I can't do that. The presentation is there. So yes. So it takes 2 to 3 days and it should be student centric. Yes.
Thank you, Tuba, for that. And yes, thank you, Mariam, for your comment as well. I just want to stop and reiterate that chapters become unnecessarily monotonous when we carry them on for too long. So you might want to handle 3 chapters. I don't know if there's anyone here in the audience who reads 3 books at the same time and likes to switch between the books. And we've got to also cater to students' learning styles. Sometimes it really helps when we do 1 chapter for about 2 lessons and then switch to another chapter and then come back to the first one. So you might want to juggle chapters or switch between chapters according to your students' needs and see how that goes. This is especially for those teachers who find it hard to develop the students' interest in the book. I do agree that activities work really well. I do agree that role play is a fantastic way of bringing a textbook to life, and also because students get a chance to physically stand in front of the class and do something. That in itself is that embodied learning, as it's called, is really productive in terms of learning. So thank you for your comments. Next slide, please, Seema. Now, this is quite interesting, and if you can click it once more for the gray box. This is really interesting. The skills that we as teachers can help develop while we teach a textbook. And Seema, you'll have to click a number of times for all the skills to show up. So there's reading, writing, there's understanding, retaining information. So we don't just want the students to process information, we also want to show them ways of retaining that information. We'd like to help them analyze the text so they're able to answer open-ended questions. We would also like to help them develop the skill to build upon their ideas creatively and to produce views and perspectives of their own. We would like them to collaborate with each other in class, in pairs, in groups, or outside of class for projects, or to teach each other and work as a team. We would like for them to be able to communicate what they've learned to others, because if the learning is all in their head, but they can't communicate it in writing, in tests or exams, then that learning is pretty much useless. We can't know, we can't evaluate how much they've learned if we can't see it on paper, or if they can't tell us about it verbally. And then we'd like them to develop some research skills so that they can learn things on their own at home and interrogate the teacher or other people for things that they don't understand and discover some bits on the topic on their own. These are some of the skills that you might want to keep in mind when you're teaching a textbook. Vygotsky in 1978 introduced the triangle as the student, textbook, and the teacher. And at that time, he said that the textbook is the mediating artifact. However, in 1990, Newton reworked this model to say that the textbook itself cannot mediate between the student and the teacher. The teacher needs to have the skill to mediate. So the textbook is pretty much useless, according to him, unless the teacher can use his or her skill to help students manipulate the content and get the best out of it. So really, in terms of focusing on the skills that the students need to develop, if the teacher has a strong grip on it, students can develop all the skills that you see on the screen in the gray box and more, because there are hundreds of other skills that we can help our students develop, not just these. These are just the core skills that I have put down here on the screen for you. Next slide, please, Seema. Thank you. And so when we think about those skills, we might want to teach students to organize information. Once you have helped the students interact with the content that you want to teach them, they've got to find a way to represent that content, that information verbally or in a written way. One way of doing that is to use graphical note making. So the outlining method of note taking was one way that works for some students who like to organize their information in a very simplified way, who can understand the text when they read it and pick out the key findings and write them down. Some students learn better when they can visualize what they're learning. Here, if you see this diagram that I have on the screen is from the grammar tree. And here we've laid out the different types of nouns in a very simplified way. And so instead of taking students through definitions of what a collective noun is, what a countable and uncountable noun is, what a common, a proper noun is, what we've done is we've put it down in one chart. And with that, we've provided examples of countable and uncountable nouns. So how many or how much? And we can lay out this difference by providing a visual along with an example, because the two of them work really well in tandem to help with retention. Many teachers talk to me about retention. How do we help our students to learn, understand, and retain the information? So how will they memorize it for their test or their exam is what I'm usually asked. But I generally tell them not to target memorization, because that is something that will stay with the students for about 2 weeks and only 2 weeks, after which it will fade out of memory, because what it's actually doing is going into short-term memory. What we want to do is we want to help them organize the information and to own it in ways that helps them interact with the information whenever they want to go back and revise it. And therefore, it stays with them longer because they're not actually cramming or memorizing it, but they're retaining it by interacting with the content. Next slide, Seema, please. Thank you. So one way of doing that is to provide examples along the way, contextualized examples. And for those of you who teach history, geography, science, maths, English, literature, whatever it is, this is versatile. This particular example that you see on the screen has been taken from our book, The Grammar Tree, but you can use this for any subject that you teach. So, for example, many people will be there at the party, or she has does not have much love for. Love is not countable, but people are countable, and so that lays out the difference between countable and uncountable nouns. Also, if you see in the bottom right rectangular box that we have, there's a cross against things that are grammatically wrong and a tick against things that are sentences that are grammatically correct. And the reason why we've put that down there is because visually it is such a strong reminder to students of what is correct and what is incorrect. It really helps them learn faster than memorizing the grammar rules. Next slide, please, Seema. Now we're going to talk about encountering challenges. And yes, I know when we talk about techniques and showing students how to study, there will be tons of challenges that they will encounter. There will also be students who lag behind the others because their pace of learning is not as fast, or they find it difficult to keep up with the rest of the class for various reasons. And as teachers, we've got to help those students along as well. So how do we do that? We can ask for personal responses individually in the class. And the reason why I say this is really important is because when students give a personal response to the text that they're reading or the text that they're listening to, then we understand very clearly what it is about the text that they've understood and what they haven't. Because if they don't have a clue, they won't be able to give you their ideas. So what do you think about this topic? For example, if you're discussing earthquakes and you say, what do you think about why earthquakes occur? What do you think about earthquakes in general? If they haven't processed the information, they won't be able to give their personal response. But if they can start a sentence with, I think, and give you your response, and you can give a chance individually to all the students in the class to do that, then they learn to think critically, they learn to think creatively, and they learn to communicate their ideas. And then, of course, you spoke about in the chat box, you spoke about making connections to real life, which is really important when we let students share their own stories and visualize, draw a diagram or a picture of what they have read or learned. And also break them up into groups and let them summarize the text and then present it to the rest of the class. So the entire group doesn't need to present, but one person from the group can be selected to come to the front of the class and present what they have summarized. And they can summarize different parts of a chapter so that you end up covering the entire chapter in very little time together as a team. Questioning is a very powerful technique where students are asked to write 5 questions based on what they have read. If students have processed the information, they will be able to produce questions. They can't produce questions if they haven't understood. What doesn't work is asking students, does that make sense? Because they'll always say yes. Or if you ask students, do you understand? They'll always say yes. The reason is students don't like to be judged by their peers. It's difficult for them to say, no, I don't understand, unless they're really desperate, and then they might come to you separately. Or sometimes they're afraid of the teacher's reaction. I know I was when I was a child, and they don't want to own up to not understanding. It's hard. And so you might want to, if you want to monitor their learning, you might want to ask very specific questions and not general ones like, do you understand? Next slide, please. Thank you. A strategy for quick and effective reading is to use a student-led approach to target the vocabulary first before we read the text. I know many teachers who make the mistake of diving into reading a text, a chapter, or a paragraph without stopping to target the vocabulary first. The paragraph that you see on the screen is from our book, Oxford English, An International Approach, which is the slightly higher level of English than you'll see in many other books on the market. And the reason is that this book caters towards schools and caters to students who want to develop a near native fluency, near native capability in the English language. For that reason, the vocabulary is diverse and there's a whole range of words that students are introduced to. What the teacher would then need to do is, you see the highlighted words on the screen. Those are the words that you would need to target before you actually start reading the text with the students. Because if we read first, it becomes very daunting for the students. They get very intimidated and scared because they see all these words that are difficult and it puts them off and the switch goes off in their heads. And then it's very difficult to develop interest in reading when they've already decided that it's too difficult for them and not easy to access. What we would need to do as teachers is talk about danger. What is danger? It harms us. How is it different from calamity? What is danger and what is a calamity? And when do we feel bewildered? And if you are in a situation, if you are in a position where you're really confused, you're bewildered because you're facing danger, there is a calamity that's come your way, what will you say and why? And what is an emergency? How do we react in an emergency? What do we do with our emotions? How do we manage ourselves? How do we decide what is essentially necessary to pick and save and what we can leave behind if we're leaving our home? Let's just say hypothetically, the home is under fire. What can we scoop up and run to save ourselves? Once we've had that conversation with the students as a whole group discussion, a plenary or in groups, then we can go on to reading the text itself because the students will then understand it better. Next, please, Simo. One other way of doing this, and it works really well for subjects like science, or where you have mathematical formulas that need to be explained, rather than explaining to the children over and over again, because we're not quite sure that they've understood, unless they've done something with their own hands or verbally to show you that they've understood. When you want them to explain a mathematical formula, or you want to test if they've understood, you can have them draw their own little picture in a notebook with speech bubbles, and then they can write down in words what the formula has asked them to do, or what the concept behind the formula is. So the Pythagoras theorem, for example, when we want to find the third side from the length of the sides, the two sides that we know, can they put down the Pythagoras theorem, not just as a formula, they can write the formula on top. Can they put it down in words to explain how it works? And the Oxford International Secondary Science book that you see, book 3 on the screen, explains how a cathode ray tube works. Once you've read this with the students, you might want to ask them to use the speech bubbles there. The man is talking and explaining how a cathode ray tube works, and he's got to explain in 3 steps what happens. And that's how they fill up the speech bubbles. When you go around the class, you can read what the students have written to know exactly who has understood the working of the cathode ray tube and who hasn't. Why is this a very powerful way of teaching children? Because this is a student-centered approach. The teacher doesn't have to explain and have the students sit there and listen, because there's no way of knowing if any learning has taken place. But when you go around and see what they have written, then you can tell very quickly if they have understood, processed the information, because they can express it and communicate it on paper. Next slide, please, Seema. Another way of doing it is to stop and summarize. And normally what teachers do is paraphrase for students. Students listen, and then students write their notes down. However, if you were to ask them to summarize the text for you, so you're not doing the summarizing, they are, and give them the 5 W's as guidelines, that might be really helpful. So what actually happened in this story, The Butterfly, that you see on the screen? And The Butterfly is from Oxford International Primary English Book 2, where the text is laid out in a very sort of uncluttered way in short paragraphs with very powerful visuals that help students understand the story better. What happened? What are we talking about? Is one question the students might want to answer in their summary. Who are we talking about? So in this case, we're talking about Abdullah and his encounter with the butterfly. How did he react to the butterfly? So his reactions, where did this happen and when? That gives you the setting and the timing. And why? Some open-ended questions about Abdullah's interaction with the butterfly. If you were to just keep the 5 W's in mind, you can help students frame questions, or you can frame questions that the students will answer verbally to summarize a text. Next slide, Seema. Thank you. Another way of doing this is to read aloud, to recount, and to review. And when we do that, and if you see the text on the screen, this is called The Old Man and the Tiger. It's got words to know in a rectangular box, which tells you which words to target before you actually start reading the text with the students. You would then ask them to look for key words that give you clues about the important details in the text. You would also ask them to draw visuals or use the visuals, look at them closely to tell the story, to gauge what's happening in the story. One group can work on the visuals, one group can work on just looking for the key information, one group in the class can work on underlining the parts of speech and talking about those, and one group can come up with the 5 W questions that we just discussed in the previous slide. And when we do different activities like that with one text and break up the class into groups, then each group can present their findings, and that way the class ends up teaching each other rather than just listening to the teacher. Next slide, please. Thank you. So student presentations are really important. Why do I keep emphasizing student presentations? Why do I keep saying that it's important for students to be able to stand in front of the class and talk? Because that's how we learn to express ourselves more clearly. And learning English is more about how well we can speak it, how well we can organize our thoughts and express ourselves fluently than about learning parts of speech. There is no point in learning loads of parts of speech if we can't bring it into usage, if we can't actually use the language to serve our purpose, which is to communicate our thoughts. And that language, so the English language, is used to express our thoughts in science, geography, history, maths, whichever other subjects we study in school. We require some command on the English language. One way of helping students gain that command on the language is to have them make very short 3-minute presentations on different parts of a chapter. They don't have to do it each class, each lesson, but you can break them up into groups and let the group choose one person who will make a 3-minute presentation. Sometimes the mistake that we make is we overburden students. We ask them to prepare a presentation for 10 to 15 minutes at one go. And that becomes very daunting, very intimidating, and students sort of shy away from that kind of workload. We might want them to come and talk about something just for 3 minutes and go back, and then do it again and again and again until it becomes second nature to the students. So, for example, you see the texts on the screen, Beautiful Bugs. And this is from Oxford International Science, Book 1. As you can see, the layout is fantastic for 6-year-olds, for 7-year-olds, because this is Book 1, and it helps them understand science in very simplified visual ways. You might want to discuss Beautiful Bugs with them and then give different groups different questions to work on. So one group can work on, why are bugs important to the environment? What do they do to the environment? Or rather, what do they do for the environment? And then what are their different colors? So they've got to find out this information from the text. And they don't have to always get it right. So they don't have to give you a perfect presentation. What you're actually doing is getting them into the habit of engaging with the text and developing their interest in the subject, and developing their ability to stand in front of the class and present their views. Which ones are dangerous to us? Very short answer questions. These will not take longer than 2 to 3 minutes. Really 3 minutes to present, 1 minute to find the answer, or 2 minutes to find the answer, 2 minutes to present. And if you can repeatedly do this with students, what you're doing is creating a student-led environment where the students are leading other students to teach the content. It makes it easier for you as a teacher as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then there's another very powerful way of helping students engage with the content, and that's called free writing. I don't know how many of you have tried that as teachers. If you have, please write down in the chat box how you've used free writing and your experience with it. Has it worked? Has it not worked? What do you think works with free writing? So many years ago, I started using free writing very early in my career in the year 2001, and it worked very successfully with middle school students. Later, when I went on to teach university students, I felt free writing works even better at that age. So this is agnostic to what age you're teaching. If you give a free writing notebook and you don't actually tell the students what to write, but you give a free writing workbook to very young students, they would really enjoy writing in it if they know that mistakes will not be corrected. So this is an excellent way to test the students' understanding of how they've engaged with the text. So if you see on the screen, we've got the people of Pakistan from our World Watch Geography book, if I'm reading correctly. So it's from our World Watch Geography book. And if you see what it says about the people of Pakistan, you might want to ask the students to read the text and then in their free writing notebooks, write how they feel about the people of Pakistan. So what is special about them? What do they do really well? And what do they eat? How do they live? What do they speak? You could ask them to write about aspects of their culture, aspects of our culture. You could ask them to write about how people at home do things. What are the family values that they follow? What are the festivals that they celebrate? What kind of food do they eat? And all of that would be free writing. So you're not actually correcting anything. You're just asking them to write whatever comes to mind. And then inevitably, when they write about the people of Pakistan, for example, they will go back to read what the textbook says about it. So what you're essentially doing is finding a way, a conduit, to get students to get involved with the text without explicitly telling them to read the text or learn the information. They will do it on their own if you create a pathway towards it. Next slide, please, Seema. Thank you. So the cone of learning kind of summarizes what I have been talking about in the last 45 minutes. Confucius said many, many years ago, I see and I forget, I hear and I remember, I do and I understand. The deepest learning takes place when students are allowed to say and do. So when they talk about what they've learned, that is when they engage with the learning. Or when they do something with their hands, that is when, which we call hands-on activities, that is when they learn really well. But students only remember 70% of what they say. So while group discussions may help, they're not as great as giving students a chance to speak individually or do something individually in class. And then students remember only 50% of what they see and what they hear. So while visuals are also important for learning, when they look at the visuals or when they listen to the teacher speak, they can't always remember what they have heard or what they have learned because they haven't engaged very, very deeply with the text. 30% of what they see is what they remember, such as mathematical formulas on the whiteboard. So if teachers put notes on the whiteboard or formulas on the whiteboard, there is only a 30% chance that students will retain that. There's only a 20% chance that students will actually retain what they hear. So when they hear explanations, they might remember them for 2 weeks, but not after 2 weeks, and only 10% of what they read. So that's the lowest form of engagement. Now, I'm sure that cone of learning is not a surprise to many of you who are experienced teachers and already know this. But if it is a surprise to you, write in the chat box and let me know if you didn't already know about the cone of learning. I would like to hear your point of view. I'd like to hear if you find it surprising, if this is something new to you. Next slide. I think this is my last slide, Seema. We're now ready for questions and comments. Please put down your questions in the chat box, and we've got about 10 minutes to address your questions. Tuba, do we have any questions in the chat box?
Been noting down the questions as the session was progressing. At the moment, we've just got some comments on what you've shared, the strategies and the things that you've talked about. And I think most of you are on the same page. We have a question here. It says, how do we choose the books? Do we choose them ourselves or do we ask the students to choose the books?
Okay, I'm not sure what kind of books. Are you talking about textbooks or are you talking about
Readers, I think, Neda, this was a question that was written in the chat box earlier on, and they were talking about how to choose the right books, because you did talk about books being effective only when, you know, they bridge the gap between what the student wants to learn. So I guess the question was regarding readers and otherwise as well. You see, because textbooks come to the teachers as part of the curriculum, but if we talk about readers, do we choose them ourselves, or do we leave it to the students to choose the books for themselves?
Okay, so if you're talking about library readers, so readers that supplement storybooks, that supplement children's learning, then it would definitely be something that children should choose for themselves according to their own interests. But when you talk about textbooks, children have no idea which textbooks will target their student learning outcomes. That is something teachers will have to choose over and over again for them, knowing what is age appropriate and knowing exactly what they want them to teach. However, I would suggest that teachers look very closely at skills in a textbook. So not just the content that will help them get through a test or an exam, but think about what skills they want to develop, which is communication, collaboration, creativity, and critical thinking, just to name a few, which we call 21st century learning or global skills, really. And think about how they can find textbooks that will cater to the development of those skills and then take it on from there. Because in the world that we live in now, it is not only about content, it is more about skills, because students will not only learn from teachers, students will learn from many different sources, from the internet, from other books, mainly from the internet and mainly from TV now. And so the teachers are not the only source of learning. So we've got to make those skills available to the students to be able to do their own research.
Yes. Thank you so much, Nida. There's another question about how do we know which exercise is necessary for the kids from the textbooks? How do we pick and choose exercises?
Yeah, that's a very good question. How do we pick and choose exercises? But do we have to pick and choose exercises ourselves, or can we give the choice to the students? I feel that students need to be given several opportunities for decision making in the classroom, especially when homework is set for them. Because if we give them questions ourselves and there is no agency that they can use, so by agency, I mean, do they feel important, empowered? Do they feel, oh, I've got 5 questions here and my teacher's asked me to do only 2. I get to choose. And that decision-making skill is really, really important to give them confidence in agency. And I think we can do the same thing in the class. We can ask them, according to their interests, choose the 3 tasks that you would like to do, or the 3 exercises that you would like to do out of the 5 or 6 exercises at the end of every chapter.
I think that would be quite helpful for the teachers. Nida, would you like to share some reading activities, interesting reading activities for the students?
Yeah, so there are reading activities actually are really, really critical, Tuba, and I'm glad someone asked that question, because reading is so important in every subject. It's not just in the English language or not just in literature that we need to help students read. If we teach them to read and they find reading interesting, then it will help them in every subject. So some reading activities that can be done in the classroom is, so it goes like this. So we divide the class into 2 groups. One group will read aloud a particular chapter. So not one person won't read the whole thing. They will take turns. So let's just say in one group you have 10 people. One by one, they'll read a few sentences until they're done with the entire page. And while they're reading it aloud, the other group will be writing down questions based on what they hear. And to be able to write down questions, they've got to listen and process. And then once they're done with the questions, one by one, the group that was listening gets to ask those questions to the ones that were reading aloud, and they have to answer those questions. The teacher will just stand on the side, facilitating this activity. The reading, the questioning, the answering is taking place among the students themselves. Why is this interesting? Because the students up their own level, their own standard of reading very, very quickly, knowing that everyone is in it together. Everyone's trying to produce their best work, and it works like magic, because I've tried it so many times among in my university classes. I know how well this particular reading strategy works. One other reading strategy is to use the good old bingo. So once the class is done with reading aloud, whether it's paragraphs or an entire chapter, the teacher reads a question aloud and has handed over strips of paper with answers to those questions scattered all around the class. The answers are with the students. They've read their strip of paper with the answer on it. As soon as they hear the question for which they have the answer in their hand, they say bingo, and they read the answer aloud. And that way we can make sure that the reading takes place with some kind of understanding, which is followed by the students answering the question. One other way of doing it is to have students sit in pairs. One person reads, the other summarizes. And then you go to the next pair. One person reads aloud, the other in the pair summarizes, and we do this throughout the class. I hope that helps.
Yes, absolutely, Nida. Can you expand a little bit more on free writing? Because we had daily journals with us in our school, and they used to write about whatever they did the previous day, maybe in the evening, maybe in the afternoon, anything that they want to share. And that gave us insight into their lives also. And it wasn't a correction, it wasn't a copy work, it wasn't anything. It was just writing the daily journal every single day. So would you like to expand on the importance of free writing here?
Yes, so free writing can work in many different ways. One way is for it to be completely free. If the students are in the habit of producing some kind of work in their journal every day, then they don't have to be guided. But for them to get to that level where it becomes a habit or second nature to them, takes a long time. Initially, students need a bit of guidance. And that starts with teachers giving them 5 questions and saying, choose any 2 out of these as guidelines for you to answer your question. So it could be something very open-ended, like someone in my house who really annoys me, or something, the favorite part of my evening every day when I go back home from school. And that's really open-ended. They're writing about their own life. If we give them about 4 or 5 topics like that to start with, and get them into the habit of free writing, help them understand that that writing is not judged, that the teacher is not going to be correcting it. They can write as much or as little as they want to. Once they get into the habit of that, once they've understood that, then they can be given topics. So for example, going back to the cathode ray tube example, if students are given a free writing notebook and told to write down how the cathode ray tube works, they're not actually expected to go back to the textbook, write down exactly how it works, and then copy it down in their notebook. It's not like that. They've got to come up with their personal response, whatever they've understood, whether it's right or wrong. They've just got to write down a paragraph about it. So what we're asking for is a personal response. Sometimes it helps to give them questions. Sometimes it helps to leave it completely open-ended for them.
Thank you so much, Nida. Some of the participants here have written that they knew about the cone of learning, and some of them have written that they did not know about it and they just got to know about it and use it in their classrooms. So, and they were thanking you for this. Also, how is a teacher a moderator between students and textbooks? You did talk about this, but if you could maybe, sum it up for the participants.
Sure. So the teacher is the one who has a very deep understanding of the skills that need to be developed. And so the teacher needs to mediate between the textbook, because the skills are embedded in the textbook along with the content. But helping students develop those skills would be the responsibility of the teacher. And ultimately, it depends on the skill that the teacher has. And one way of doing that is to understand the book really, really well and to have an awareness of what skills you're targeting so that you can work towards them. But without the teacher's mediation, the students can't exactly use the textbook. They will never know how.
That is true. Nida, thank you so much. We've got 1 more minute to go. I would like to tell the participants that I've shared the link for the evaluation form and the handout for this session in the chat box. If you want me to share it again, I'll do that. Nida, thank you so much. The session was very interesting, I must say, very effective, and I hope it was a learning experience. I can see the comments in the chat box, and they've been talking about it being fruitful. Thank you once again, Nida. Please join us tomorrow at 4 o'clock for Heading in the Right Direction, school improvement strategies. Please do join us. It's going to be yet another very interesting session tomorrow, heading in the right direction, school improvement strategies. And I would like to request the participants to share their evaluation, share their feedback with us. The link for the evaluation forms and the handout are in the chat box right now.
Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Tuba, for moderating. And I also want to remind you all to fill out the evaluation form for the certificates that you will get, and that's very essential for the certificates that you will get emailed to you in your inbox. Thank you, everyone, and Khuda Hafiz.